Fellas, this weekend we're back in Mexico with Brandon Moreno taking on Steve Erceg, and honestly, as long as we get at least 3 finishes, 3 good knockouts on this card, I'm taking this above UFC London. UFC London has completely ruined the standards of a good UFC card nowadays, so hopefully Mexico can pull through, and as usual, we're going to be breaking down every fighter on the card, as well as my own personal predictions. Going in there with the first fight, which is going to be Austin Hubbard versus MarQuel Mederos. Austin Hubbard had a decent career outside of the UFC, managed to become LFA champion, and then essentially just became a bit of a win-loss fighter in the UFC. He did nothing really significant, couldn't really finish his fight, so eventually he inevitably got cut from the organization. Got a 2-fight winning streak outside the UFC, including the win over Julian Lane, Let Me Bang. Then he went over to the Ultimate Fighter Chandler versus McGregor season and ended up winning on the Ultimate Fighter. And then his past 3 fights, he's been submitted by Kurt Holloway, got a good win over Figlak, and recently lost to Alexander Hernandez in his most recent fight at UFC. I think it was 3-3. Going to be taking on MarQuel Mederos. This guy outside of the UFC has been on a tear in Fury FC specifically. Got a good knockout on the Contender Series and has been out for quite some time, but got his UFC debut, got a victory in his UFC debut about a year ago from now. So Austin Hubbard, MarQuel Mederos, prospect versus a guy that's kind of just sat there in the UFC, not really doing anything significant. I'm going to go with MarQuel Mederos to win this one. Now, he's inexperienced. He's nowhere near as experienced at the highest level like a guy like Austin Hubbard, which is my only concern, but his strikings look really talented. Outside and inside the UFC, he's look really good on the feet, very crafty on the feet. His kicks and his knees to the body are amazing. Austin Hubbard's a bit of a journeyman these days, isn't really doing anything with his career, and I trust MarQuel Mederos. He has been out for quite some time, but he's been preparing for a fight. I think it was a couple of weeks ago anyway, so yeah, he's ready to fight. I'm hoping he's going to be prepared. He's a younger guy, looks to be a lot more promising than Austin Hubbard, and even though Austin Hubbard might have that kind of, I'm not even going to call him a veteran because he ain't a veteran. The guy's just come through in the Ultimate Fighter, but a guy that's a lot more experienced, I don't think he's going to pull through. I'm going MarQuel Mederos to piece up Austin Hubbard, get a unanimous decision win. Because Austin Hubbard's tough, I think he'll survive, but I'm going to go MarQuel Mederos by decision. Then we've got Jamall Emmers versus Gabriel Miranda. Jamall Emmers had a really good career outside of the UFC starting off, and he actually ended up beating Alexander Hernandez, who's now doing his thing in the UFC, become a champion in a different organization as well. And then after that, he had an even better turn. Now, he did lose a couple of fights, but he ended up beating Corey Sandhagen on the regional scene, as well as Chris Avila, who's Nate Diaz's boy. Did lose to Thiago Moises, so he's fought some UFC caliber fighters, and that win over Corey Sandhagen is obviously aged amazingly. Comes through and loses on the Contender Series, puts together 4 straight wins outside of the UFC, loses his UFC debut again to Giga Chikadze, but since then has been a bit of a win-loss fighter, losing to Sabatini, Jack Jenkins, and Nate Landwehr. So essentially any prospect this guy goes against, he ends up losing to, and he did just get finished brutally by Nate Landwehr a couple of months back. He's going to be taking on Gabriel Miranda, who also had a really good career outside the UFC. The quality of opponents weren't the best, but he was on a bit of a tear. Ended up going on a 2-fight losing streak on the regional scene to get back on another winning streak. Lost his UFC debut to Benoit Saint Denis, then picked up a win, and then lost to Morgan Chairez at UFC, I think it was Paris last year. So he's 1-2 in the UFC, is Gabriel Miranda. I'm not entirely sure if Gabriel Miranda's UFC worthy. You look at his record outside of the UFC, it isn't the highest quality opponents. I think I might go with Jamall Emmers to win this one. He's beaten so much better opponents outside of the UFC, which is what I'm going to be mainly basing this off. Like I said, the win over Corey Sandhagen and Chris Avila is aged amazingly. And he's not that bad of a striker. He's just a little bit chinny. His defense isn't the best, but unless he gets taken into a submission, which I think is unlikely because we've seen Jamall Emmers with decent submission defense in the past, I think he's going to win this one by knockout. He's a much better striker than Gabriel Miranda. Miranda's not the best striker in the UFC, what he's displayed. BSD finished him, Morgan Chairez finished him, and I know those are 2 tough Frenchmen, but I'm going with Jamall Emmers to knock him out. More experienced, seems to be a lot more UFC worthy, it seems to be more UFC caliber. I'm going Jamall Emmers to beat Gabriel Miranda by knockout. I'm just not sure if Gabriel Miranda is exactly UFC worthy at this moment in time, and even though Jamall Emmers is a bit of a journeyman, seems to pack a punch, seems to be dangerous, seems to have more talent, I'm going Gabriel Miranda by knockout. Then we have a really interesting fight. Melquizael Costa, who fought like a month ago against Christian Rodriguez. Now, Melquizael Costa is the only fighter currently in the UFC with Vitiligo, and he has one of the most even records I've seen in the UFC, with an even amount of knockouts, submissions, and decisions throughout his MMA career. Had a really good start to his MMA career, took a couple of losses, but bounced right back on another big winning streak outside the UFC. And since joining the UFC, he did have a shaky start, losing to Thiago Moises and Steve Garcia, but, you can't really blame him for losing to those 2 guys, and he has won 3 fights in the UFC. He's on a 2-fight finishing streak, and he just recently beat Andre Philly by submission, where he looked really good in that fight just over a month ago from now. We're going to be taking on Christian Rodriguez. The best way to describe Christian Rodriguez is he's a prospect killer. Comes into the UFC on a huge finishing streak as a big prospect in himself, gets a win in the Contender Series. Then he has to go and fight outside the UFC again for some reason. And then since joining the UFC, he's had a pretty solid career so far. And this is why it's been called the Prospect Killer. Shuts down the prospect of Raul Rosas Jr. by beating him dominantly. Shuts down the prospect of Cameron Saaimon by beating him dominantly. Shuts down the prospect of Isaac Dulgaria by beating him comfortably. And recently, in his most recent fight, shut down the prospect of Austin Bashi by beating him comfortably. So he is now one of the biggest prospect killers in the UFC. Whenever there's a big prospect, you want to pick Christian Rodriguez to beat him. And now, even though some would class Melquizael Costa as that prospect, I'm still leaning towards Costa to win this one by a decision. Melquizael Costa looked really good against Andre Fili. I know that was a month ago and you might be concerned because he's fighting on really short notice, but he looked amazing against Andre Fili. His striking was amazing, and I think Andre Fili's probably the better striker than Christian Rodriguez. He looked really light on the feet against Andre Fili, tagged him, and Andre Fili had to inevitably shoot a takedown, which ended up resulting in him getting submitted. I think when it comes to submission, Melquizael Costa takes it. He's looked good in the UFC so far. He's only lost to top opponents outside of the rankings of the featherweight division, and I think his grappling, his striking is probably better than Christian Rodriguez. Now, Rodriguez does look a lot better at 145 compared to when he was at 135, but I'm not picking him to beat Melquizael Costa in this situation. He's coming off a good win over Austin Bashi, but the guy had never fought in the UFC before, and he lost to Julian Erosa, which hasn't aged that well. So as underrated as Christian Rodriguez is, and as much as he's kind of made a name for himself by beating other prospects, I'm going to go Melquizael Costa by decision. I think he just outlands Christian Rodriguez on the feet. He looked, like I said before, really good against Andre Fili on the feet. He was outstriking Andre Fili, made him shoot a takedown. And if the grappling engagements do come along, I'm obviously going to favour Melquizael Costa. I'm going to go Melquizael Costa to win this one by decision. Hopefully, Christian Rodriguez doesn't prove me wrong once again, because I seem to always pick against him, but Melquizael Costa by decision. Then we've got Rafa Garcia versus Vinc Pichel. Rafa Garcia, huge winning streak outside the UFC with a shit ton of finishes, becoming a champion on the local organizations. And essentially, since joining the UFC, he's been a bit of a win-loss fighter. There's not really much you can say. Lost his most recent fight dominantly to Grant Dawson after taking a bit of a layoff, where he got basically taken down and ground and pound the fuck out of and finished by Grant Dawson. Going to be taking on Vinc Pichel, who's a bit of a veteran in the UFC. Been competing since 2009. Comes through on the Ultimate Fighter. Goes on a 3-fight winning streak on the Ultimate Fighter. That was when Cruz and Uriah Faber was competing, and then ended up losing the last 2 fights on the Ultimate Fighter as well. Since then, he went on the UFC run, only losing to Gregor Gillespie. Been very inactive, but picking up a lot of straight wins, and in his last 2 fights, he's lost his last 2 fights in a row to Mark Madsen and Ismail Bonfim. Again, not really being the most active fighter. I could see Vinc Pichel kind of dogging this one out because of his experience, because he is experienced in the UFC, and Rafa Garcia, again, he's not the most active fighter either, and apart from that win over Clay Guida, he hasn't beaten any crazy opponents yet, but I'm going to go with Rafa Garcia to win this one by decision. Vinc Pichel was doing his thing against Ismail Bonfim, to be fair. He didn't look horrible in that fight, but he's very inactive. He's getting up there in age. He's in his 40s. He's lost his last 2 fights. He's been quite inactive. Rafa Garcia does seem to be the better boxer out of the 2 of them. I think Rafa Garcia keeps this fight standing and just purely outboxes Vinc Pichel. And when it comes to the grappling, Rafa Garcia has shown that he's got good wrestling too. I really feel like wherever Rafa Garcia decides to take the fight, he can win. I'm not sure if he's going to finish a guy like Vinc Pichel, who's a veteran and, like I said, was able to hold his own against some other tough opponents and actually has some really good wins, like the one of a Jim Miller, Roosevelt Roberts, who was once tough, and Austin Hubbard. But I'm going Rafa Garcia by decision. I think he keeps this at boxing range, outboxes Vinc Pichel, and if there's going to be anybody, taking it to the mat, it's going to be Rafa Garcia, where, again, I would give him the advantage against Vinc Pichel. I think he mixes it up if he's smart and gets this one done by decision. He competed not too long ago as well against Grant Dawson. That was only like a few months back. So Rafa Garcia by decision over Vinc Pichel, who is probably nearing retirement anyway. Then we've got Julia Polastri versus Lupita Godinez. Now, Julia had a good run outside the UFC, became a champion on the local scene. Lost on the Contender Series to Jasmine Jesuda Vicious, but that's no shame because she's now doing her thing. After that, went on a 4-fight winning streak. Again, lost her UFC debut to Josephine Knudsen. Then after that, beat Corey McKenna by split decision in the most recent fight to save her UFC contract. You're going to be taking on Lupita Godinez, who had a huge amateur career, beating Sam Hughes a couple of times, or had a draw with Sam Hughes, and ended up beating Sam Hughes for the belt in the amateur scene. And is also the sister of an Olympic wrestler, so you can kind of guess what type of fighting style she's got for Lupita Godinez. But after that, went on a good start to her professional career, going on a huge winning streak, becoming a champion in LFA. Goes on a bit of a run in the UFC for her first couple of fights, where she does seem to be going on a bit of an upward trajectory and actually managed to set the record for the fastest turnaround in modern history. She fought twice in the span of 7 days, and then she had an amazing 2023 where she won not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times in 2023. Probably became the female fighter of the year, but she's now on a 2-fight losing streak to Mackenzie Dern and Virgin Andaroba, some of the top of the strawweight division. In terms terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go Lupita Godinez to win this one by decision. It does seem like a bit of a step down for Lupita Godinez. She's gone from essentially top contenders of her division to a fighter who I'm not even entirely convinced is UFC worthy. Julia Polastri, she lost to Josephine Knudsen, she lost to Jasmine Judovicius, and she's coming off a split decision over Corey McKenna. As far as I'm aware, Corey McKenna's not even in the UFC anymore, so go to a split decision with her hasn't been amazing. Now, Julia Polastri's not bad on the feet. She's got a decent level of striking, but it just goes to show, it's a case of I believe that Lupita Godinez wins the fight anywhere it goes. If it's a stand-up fight, I think Lupita Godinez completely, not pieces up, but definitely does the better and outlands Julia Polastri. But I think inevitably Lupita Godinez is going to mix it up with the grappling, where I give her a massive advantage. She's faced better strikers than Polastri and beaten her. She didn't even look that bad against Verna Jandiroba, who's like a fight away from a title shot. She actually looks good in that fight. So I think Lupita Godinez, she's going to mix it up with the wrestling, completely out-wrestle Julia Polastri. And even if Julia Polastri randomly develops an amazing takedown defense, I think Lupita Godinez's hands are going to be enough to keep her in this fight. And I really do feel like this is just a fight to kind of get Lupita Godinez back in the winning column in Mexico. So I'm going to go Lupita Godinez to win this one by a pretty dominant decision. I was going to go by a stoppage, but Lupita Godinez can't really seem to buy a stoppage to save her life. Lupita Godinez by decision. Then we have the new Francis Ngannou, Ateba Gautier versus Jose Medina. Now, Gautier is like the modern-day Francis Ngannou, not only because of his style, not only because of his build, but also where he's from the exact same places Francis Ngannou. And so far in his MMA career, he's just had a bunch of first-round finishes, knocking people out, and he looks very, very athletic as well. He's not just one of these ploddy, you see these muscular fighters in the UFC that are very ploddy, don't really have anything going for them when it comes to athletics. This guy's athletic as fuck and got a good knockout on the Contender Series to secure a UFC contract. Going to be taking on Jose Medina, who actually had a really good run outside the UFC, becoming a champion on a couple of local organizations. Lost on the Contender Series to Magomed Gadzhizulov, where he actually put up a decent fight, and then lost his UFC debut to Zachary Reese. This does seem, again, like another fight where it's kind of... The UFC, for some reason, want Jose Medina in the UFC. I still don't understand why he got a shot after his fight with Gadzhizulov. I know he didn't put up that big of a fight, and he has dropped a few weight classes, but I don't think he's UFC worthy. I'm going to be going with Ateba Gautier to win this one. Now, there is still some questions regarding Gautier. How good is his grappling? How good is his takedown defense? And we've seen it recently as well on, like, Apex cards where knockout prospects on the Contender Series have fought their first proper grappler, and they've been completely out-grappled. But I feel like in this case, I'm trusting that Gautier is going to get this one done. Very, very athletic and powerful striker who's just been slaughtering people straight. Just got a good win on the Contender Series. And Jose Medina, he just seems to dog it out. If you look at him on the regional scene, he just seems to be able to dog it out against lower level fighters, and he hasn't been able to do that in the UFC so far. Now, the reason I'm hesitant about picking Gautier by KO is because Medina's tough. He survived Magomed Gadzhizulov, which I guess isn't that difficult to survive. It isn't like Gadzhizulov's a knockout machine, but also surviving Zachary Reese. He didn't look that bad against Zachary Reese, but I just believe that Ateba Gautier, with the athletic striking that he's shown, I believe he's much more UFC worthy than Medina. Much better striking, even if you just compare them in the UFC and the regional scene. Much better striking than Medina. It really just comes down to a case of, can Medina take the fight to the mat? He's not a heavy grappler anyway. I think Ateba keeps this one standing, and eventually within the fight lands on the button of Medina. And even though Medina's got a solid chin, I'm going to go Gautier to win this one by KO in the second round to secure his first UFC win. Then we've got Edgar Chairez versus CJ Vergara, two low-level flyweights. Edgar Chairez, so far, all of his wins have been by stoppage. He's a very dangerous fighter. Decent run outside the UFC, I guess you can say. Ended up losing to Jesus Aguilar, which isn't much shame because he's a monster in the flyweight division. Lost on the Contender Series again. He lost to a pretty solid fighter in Clayton Carpenter. Picks up 2 wins on the regional scene. Loses UFC debut again to a tough flyweight in Tatsuro Taira. Ends up getting a no contest against Lacerda, where he inevitably changed that into a finish against Lacerda. And then his most recent fight, UFC 306, lost to Joshua Van. Again, not that tough of a, can't shame him for losing to Joshua Van. He's one of the biggest flyweight prospects. CJ Vergara had a pretty dodgy start to his MMA career, wasn't the best. Also ended up losing to Jonathan Martinez on the regional scene. Picked up a 4-fight winning streak after Raul, becoming a champion on the local scene, and got a good finish on the Contender Series to secure a UFC contract. And essentially since then, he's just been put against tough fights, and he just can't seem to deliver in every tough fight that he's been put against. He's missed weight on 3 different occasions and won't miss a weight class, and he's been notably finished by Ramazan Temirov recently, where he got smoked and submitted by Tatsuro Taira. I don't think CJ Vergara is UFC worthy. In that fight with Temirov, he was kind of just running around the octagon until eventually he got clipped, and they've shown that in other fights as well. I think it was a Lacerda fight as well, where he nearly got finished and he just started sprinting around the octagon, where he managed to make a comeback. But CJ Vergara seems to, hesitant to engage. stage. I'm going to go Edgar Chairez to win this one by decision. Not an easy fight for Chairez, but I feel like Chairez is tough, man. He's been able to survive guys like Tatsuro Taira, Joshua Van, and he has looked pretty good with the stand-up so far. Tough guy as well as Edgar Chairez, so I'm picking him to win this one by decision. I'm not sure that CJ Vergara is UFC worthy. It wasn't even that long ago when he got knocked out by Ramazan Temurov too. It was only like 2-3 months ago, and he's already coming back against Edgar Chairez. And Edgar Chairez, like we said before, dangerous guy, great submission ability. I really do believe if he wants to keep this fight standing, he can keep it standing on the feet with CJ Vergara, but I inevitably think he's going to take him down and do his best work with the grappling. I'm going Edgar Chairez to win this one by decision. Then we have David Martinez versus Saaimon Oliveira again. Going with the theme of giving layup fights. I feel like this is just a layup fight for David Martinez. Anyway, a background on David Martinez. This guy's actually a surgeon. He fights while also doing surgery at the same time. That's his main job, being a surgeon. But he's also a knockout machine outside of being a surgeon. You know, just straight sleeping people. If you look at the contenders, if you look at the regional scene, huge amount of knockouts on the regional scene. Big knockout machine. Became a champion on the local organization. Ended up getting a win on the contender series after he completely dogged it out. And he looked good in that fight too, because he showed that he could come back from adversity. Got dropped on the contender series. Still ended up dogging out and getting the win. Going to be taking on Saaimon Oliveira, who had a big, massive career outside of the UFC. Again, like a lot of other people, becoming a champion in the local organization. Won on the contender series, but so far is 0-2 in the UFC. He's lost both of his fights in the UFC. One pretty dominant decision and one where he got finished by Daniel Marcos, who's now a big bantamweight prospect. I'm going to go with David Martinez to win this one by knockout in the first round. Saaimon Oliveira, I mean, first of all, has been very inactive. He hasn't fought in ages, and now he's going to be taking on this young, hungry knockout machine in David Martinez. I'm very excited for David Martinez. Dangerous striker, really good at boxing as well. I really think in the division that he's in, he could go forward with the boxing. Can David Martinez in the bantamweight division? He's got really crisp hands. His KO, his ability to set up KOs are amazing. We've seen him be able to come back from adversity as well on the contender series, where he got dropped and came back and absolutely pieced up his opponent. I think it was Jose who he was fighting. And Saaimon Oliveira, great guillotine, great submission game, but again, he's shown that he's not really UFC worthy. Bit of a fraudulent career before the UFC. I'm going David Martinez to KO him in the first round. Keeps the fight standing, eventually lands on the button. Again, I feel like this is one of those layup fights to kind of build the name of David Martinez in Mexico, so I'm going David Martinez by KO in the very first round. And then we have Raul Rosas Jr. against Vinc Morales. Raul Rosas Jr., obviously, the youngest fighter in UFC history, debuted from the contender series at 17 years old. Had a really good run running up to the UFC with nothing but stoppages, just submitting people straight. Got a good win on the contender series, like I said. Submitted Jay Perrin in his UFC debut. Ended up getting kind of, I don't want to say a fraud check, but lost his first fight to Christian Rodriguez as a massive favourite. But since then, he picked up a knockout victory, a submission victory over Ricky Tercios, and he recently beat Archie Lung at UFC 306 by a decision. They're going to be taking on Vinc Morales, who is the cousin, I think, of Ricky Saaimon. He's had a really strange UFC run as Vinc Morales, so he builds a name for himself by just going out and slaughtering people outside of the UFC, loses on the contender series, picks up another win outside the UFC on Bellator, and comes back to the UFC. Can't really seem to put together a big winning streak, ends up losing the majority of his fights, but to be fair, he's losing to Jonathan Martinez, Song Yadong, and Chris Gutierrez, who were some top bantamweights, and he did manage to beat Emmers Zahabi too, so he eventually got cut from the UFC. Put together 5 straight wins outside the UFC with 4 finishes, becoming a champion on the local organization. And so far, he's back in the UFC on another 2-fight losing streak against Taylor Lapilus and Elijah Smith. And he actually fought Elijah Smith only 5 weeks ago, sorry. So he's been a pretty quick turnaround against Raul Rosas Jr. Now, even though, to be fair, Vinc Morales doesn't have the best record, he has shown to be pretty tough. He was very close to finishing Elijah Smith in his most recent fight, almost submitted him. And even in his fight with Taylor Lapilus was a very dangerous featherweight when he was in the UFC, so it's not an easy fight for Raul Rosas Jr., but I am going to be picking him to win. We know that Vinc Morales isn't the highest level grappler. I know he's got submission ability and he nearly submitted Elijah Smith, but he got taken down and dominated with the grappling in that fight, nearly got finished. And I feel like Raul Rosas Jr., he's kind of got better and better in each fight. The experience is enough for him in the UFC. He looked really good in the Ricky Tercios fight. He was against another chaotic kind of well-rounded fighter. So I think Raul Rosas Jr. gets this one done, takes the fight to the mat, and eventually will just completely wear out Vinc Morales. I don't know if he finds a submission because Morales displayed good submission defense in his most recent fight, but I'm going Raul Rosas Jr. to win this one by decision. Takes it to the mat, beats him on the ground, beats him with his ground game, and even on the feet, Raul Rosas Jr.'s stand-up has improved tenfold. Like, I know he's not an elite striker or anything, but I really do feel like he could hang on the feet with Vinc Morales. I'm not saying that's the smart thing to do, but I feel like he could, so I'm going to go Vinc Morales. I'm going to go Raul Rosas Jr. to win this one by unanimous decision. And then we have Kelvin Gastelum versus Joe Pyfer. The guy with an iron chin versus the guy with an iron fist. Knockout ability versus the best chin. Kelvin Gastelum starts his MMA career on a huge winning streak on the regional scene. Comes on the Ultimate Fighter Jones versus Sonlin, ends up winning 4 straight fights on the Ultimate Fighter, actually won the entire tournament on that season, and became the youngest fighter in UFC history, or the Ultimate Fighter history, to win the tournament. Then he goes on a bit of an upward trajectory UFC career, taking a couple of losses, but it's all going bright for him. Notably knocked out Michael Bisping as well as getting a good win over Ronaldo. And then after that, had a fight of the year, fight of a lifetime contender fight with Israel Adesanya, which I never thought I'd say. But had an absolute dogfight against Israel Adesanya. Actually ended up getting in the Hall of Fame recently for one of the best fights in UFC history. Fight of the year for 2019. One of the best fights ever. And since then, well, after that, he had a bit of not the best career in the middleweight division. Ended up going 4-1 in his next couple of fights. But since then, he's beaten Chris Curtis in the in the middleweight division by a very close dogfight. Ended up getting submitted by Sean Brady and beat Daniel Rodriguez in his most recent fight. But because he can't put the fork down, he's had to move back up to the middleweight division to take on Joe Pyfer, who had a very solid start to his MMA career, the majority of it being stoppages. Managed to become a champion in the local scene. Lost on the contender series, but he lost due to injury. Picked up another win on the regional scene and goes straight back to the contender series with a knockout. Followed up by another knockout. Followed up by another knockout. Followed up by a submission. And then eventually lands himself in a main event of a fight night against Jack Hermansson. And gets outstruck and just loses to Jack Hermansson, who's the gritty veteran in the middleweight division. And in his most recent fight, brutalized and slept Marc-Andre Barrios. Face plants him on the floor. And now he's going to be taking on Kelvin Gastelum. It's tough, man, because Kelvin Gastelum looked decent in the welterweight division. He seemed like borderline ranked in the welterweight division. Obviously, he's got really good hands, tough as nails, great chin, which is why I'm not going to be picking Joe Pyfer to win this one by knockout. And also, Joe Pyfer, the one elite fighter that he's fought in Jack Hermansson, who's predominantly a grappler, he's been outstruck by. But I am going to go with Joe Pyfer to win this one by decision, because we've seen multiple times that Kelvin Gastelum, in my opinion at least, looks a lot better in the welterweight division than he does in the middleweight division. And in the middleweight division, he's been losing to the likes of Canada with a top, he's been losing to the top opponents, but he's been getting completely pieced up. But even in that fight with Chris Curtis, you can make an argument to say that Chris Curtis should have won that fight. Joe Pyfer, I'm expecting his striking to have improved tenfold since that fight with Jack Hermansson. He has got the KO threat as well, which I don't think he's going to KO Gastelum because of his chin, but I can just see Joe Pyfer doing the better with the boxing, keeping Gastelum at range, picking him apart. And I think if anybody's going to mix it up with the grappling, it is going to be Joe Pyfer. He trains with Sean Brady at that gym that produced monster grapplers. He's been competing in grappling tournaments as well as Joe Pyfer, so I do expect to see a bit of a grappling approach as well from Joe Pyfer, where he mixes the striking up with the grappling along with the knockout threat. So I think everything taken into account, it's a tough fight for Joe Pyfer, especially when we've only seen him compete once against an elite fighter in Jack Hermansson, but I'm picking him to win by decision. I think Joe Pyfer's definitely got more potential as of right now than Kelvin Gastelum, so I'm going Joe Pyfer to win this one via decision. Then we have Ronaldo Rodriguez against Kevin Borchaz. Now, Ronaldo Rodriguez is a massive star in Mexico. Over 2 million followers on Instagram. And he's pretty much a celebrity over there. I don't know why he still competes in MMA. What a terrible job to go down. Anyway, on the regional scene, bunch of stoppages, bunch of wins, loses on the contender series, puts together another 5 wins outside the UFC, gets a finish in his UFC debut, and recently got a good win over Odi Osbourne at UFC 306 in a dogfight. Going to be taking on Kevin Borchaz, who's got, if you look at his record, it shows that he's got KO ability, but I kind of want to disagree with that. He's been getting a lot of knockouts on the regional scene, and he did come through on the contender series, but he is 0-2 in the UFC so far, losing to Joshua Van, and also losing in his most recent fight, losing to Alessandro Costa. I'm going to go Ronaldo Rodriguez to win this one by submission in the first round. Again, going down the theme of giving these Mexicans easy fights. Kevin Borchaz, I just still think he's UFC worthy, man. I know he's got KO ability, and he seems to have heavy hands, but he isn't even the best technical striker. He didn't look that bad against Joshua Van, but you even look on the regional scene, his hands aren't the best. Even though he has KO ability, his boxing itself is awful. And I know that Ronaldo Rodriguez isn't like a big flyweight prospect or somebody that people think is going to go down this path of doing really well, but his grappling is much better than Kevin's grappling. I think he mixes it up with the grappling and just submits him in the very first round. Even if he was to keep it standing, I think Ronaldo Rodriguez has a better chance of outstriking Kevin than Kevin does of outstriking Ronaldo Rodriguez. So I'm predicting Ronaldo Rodriguez to take this one to the mat and find the submission early on in the fight, submitted him in the first round, because he looked impressive in that fight with Odi Osbourne. Even though it was a very close fight, a lot of people should have said Osbourne won. The fact that he was able to come back from that near stoppage of Odi Osbourne and come back and win the fight, Ronaldo Rodriguez, I'm picking him to win this one by sub in the very first round. Then we've got Manuel Torres versus Drew Dober. Manuel Torres, this guy had a decent run outside of the UFC, comes through and gets a knockout on the Contender Series, followed up by another knockout, followed up by another knockout, followed up by a submission over Chris Duncan, which is quite well, but in his most recent fight at UFC 306, got knocked out by Ignacio Bahamondes, and he's going to be fighting Drew Dober, who has been just basically the unk of the UFC. He's been in the UFC for so long, but his MMA career, starting in 2009, upward trajectory, came through on the Ultimate Fighter Cruz versus Faber, where he ended up losing, put together another couple of wins outside of the regional scene, comes back on the Ultimate Fighter the Ronda Rousey season, ends up losing that as well, but the UFC gave him a contract anyway, so since essentially from 2014 to 2020 went on this upward trajectory, took a couple of losses here and there, but was winning fights on a consistent basis, ended up doing some modeling part-time as well, which is kind of his side job now, and since then, again, it's been the same thing. He's been taking a couple of losses to good fighters, but he has been winning and putting together winning streaks every now and then, with the most notable win being over Bobby Green, where he slept Bobby Green, and also his most notable loss being him getting submitted by Islam Makhachev. I'm going to go Drew Dober to win this one by TKO in the second round. If there's anybody that you don't want to come back from after getting knocked out, it's Drew Dober. Drew Dober hits like an absolute truck. We've seen it multiple times. He's faced tough guys before and put them out cold. Guys who actually thought would outbox and you just completely outstrike Drew Dober. And Manuel Torres, even though he has looked good on the feet, he's been looking good on the feet against much lower level fighters. That submission victory over Chris Duncan has aged quite well, but Drew Dober's got really good grappling defense. He was able to survive quite some time against Islam Makhachev. He was able to take it to a decision against Tanato Moicano, and you look at who he's losing to recently, Frivola, Moicano, Silva. These are some top 20 lightweights in the world. I know Silva's now moved down to featherweight. And on top of that, I just think Drew Dober, like I said, it's a terrible matchup for Manuel Torres. You've just been knocked out by Ignacio Bahamondes. You want to step down in competition, and you're facing another knockout machine and a veteran of the lightweight division, a guy who's been in the UFC for so long, faced so many different styles. I think Drew Dober gets this one done by TKO. Lands on the button of Manuel Torres, knocks him out, probably goes for the ground and pound finish and finishes him by TKO. I even think if anybody's going to mix it up with the grappling, it is probably going to be Manuel Torres, but it isn't even like Drew Dober's got bad grappling. His wrestling's a decent level. It's just that Manuel Torres probably has the better submission abilities he showed in that fight with Chris Duncan, but I'm going Drew Dober to TKO in the second round. Had Manuel Torres not just been put to sleep by Bahamondes, I might have been going a different way, but I'm going Drew Dober to get this one by TKO in the second round. Then he's tough as well as Drew Dober. He survived that beating from Gene Silva, where the only reason the fight got stopped was because there was an eye injury and he got caught on his face. So Drew Dober by TKO in the second round is my final pick. And then we've got the main event. This should be a solid main event. I know last week's card in London was very lackluster. This fight should be anything but lackluster. Brandon Moreno versus Steve Erceg. You don't need an introduction to Brandon Moreno. This guy's done everything, man. Become the flyweight champion of the world. One of the best boxers right now, I'd say, in the flyweight division. And he's just a good personality. You can't really dislike Brandon Moreno, taking on Steve Erceg, who had a really good run on the regional scene, which is partly the reason why he was able to land a title shot against Pantoja, which we'll get onto. Also beat Cody Haddon on the regional scene too, became a champion on the scene too. Won his first two UFC fights against David Dvorak and Alessandro Costa in impressive fashion, and then absolutely pieced up and knocked out Matt Schnell, which actually landed him a title fight against Pantoja last year at UFC 301 in May, where he actually lost a really close decision to Pantoja. That could have gone either way. Lost a title fight, and in his most recent fight, got knocked out in the first round by Kai Kara France. Going to be taking on Brandon Moreno now. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm going to go Moreno to win this one by decision. I've just got no real reason to pick Steve Erceg to win this one. I mean, if we're going off recent fights, Brandon Moreno's coming off that dominant performance where he just completely pieced up Amir Albazi for 5 rounds straight. He also arguably should have been able to beat Brandon Royval, so I thought he won the decision, and obviously had that dogfight with Pantoja. Steve Erceg, I know he's a decent grappler, comes from a grappling background, but it isn't like Moreno's a bad grappler in himself. Moreno's got submission ability. The guy submitted Figueiredo, for fuck's sake. So I think Moreno's grappling's definitely the better in this fight, at least from a submission perspective. And I just don't trust Steve Erceg, who's just been knocked out by Kai Kara France, and his best win is Matt Schnell, who I don't even think is in the UFC anymore, to beat the number one guy, Brandon Moreno. You've lost to 2 top guys, and he's now fighting another top guy. I think Brandon Moreno completely pieces up Steve Erceg. Steve Erceg's probably going to try and mix it up with the grappling if he's smart, which I don't think he's going to be able to do. Brandon Moreno's been fighting so many grapplers. Amir Albazi, Davison Figueiredo, Pantoja. He's probably fought them like a combined nearly 10 times now. So Brandon Moreno's used to being an anti-grappler. Steve Erceg's not going to be the guy to take Brandon down and beat him with the grappling. And if it does stay on the feet, I know Steve Erceg's got decent boxing. He showed it in the fight with Matt Schnell, but even in the Pantoja fight, the only reason Steve Erceg looked crisp in that fight with Pantoja because Pantoja was one of the scrappiest, unorthodox fighters in the UFC, where he just charges at people looking for the takedown. That's not Brandon Moreno. He's one of the crispest, quickest boxers in the flyweight division. I honestly think we're going to see Brandon Moreno's hands flying this fight. Pieces up Steve Erceg, outboxes him across 5 rounds straight. I was also going to predict a late stoppage, but I think Steve Erceg's probably going to be able to dog this one out. Maybe he's chinned in a bit of a tough situation since that Kai France loss, but either way, I'm going Brandon Moreno to get back in the winning streak column, potentially on a title shot, and outbox Steve Erceg. I don't know why Erceg took this fight. I know he was supposed to fight Azu Omobayev, I think it was a while ago, but this is a terrible fight for Erceg. You've just lost your last 2 fights, coming off a knockout loss, and you're facing arguably the best striker in the division, who's coming off a win. I'm going Brandon Moreno to win this one by unanimous decision. But those are my picks for UFC Mexico, my breakdowns of every fighter. Let me know your thoughts on this fight night. If you agree with the picks, anything else you want to say about the card, let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.